This is part 2 of your muscle physiology lecture, chapter 12, beginning with muscle metabolism. So when your muscle contracts, we need ATP. We've looked at how we need calcium and ATP for our skeletal muscle contraction to occur. Now, where do you get this ATP supply? So there's 3 places where muscles can generate ATP. And one of them is called substrate level phosphorylation. That is with an enzyme. And then we have anaerobic respiration, which is just the glycolysis step in the cellular respiration pathway. And then we have the entire cellular respiration pathway, or oxidative phosphorylation, where we make ATP using the electron transport chain. So 3 different ways that we can make ATP. So let's look at the picture here. Our muscles can have ATP with or without oxygen, and different fiber types will lean towards either using oxygen predominantly or making ATP in anaerobic methods predominantly. But let's take a look at what's going on in this picture. So the entire cellular respiration pathway is starting from our glucose, So glucose can come in from the bloodstream. We can see this, right? Or it could be because of breakdown of glycogen. Either way, we're getting glucose. It undergoes glycolysis. This is the first step in the cellular respiration. It goes on to enter the Krebs cycle, and then we finish up with our electron transport chain in oxidative phosphorylation. So this main pathway is going to make the most ATP, right? So this is going to give you a lot of ATP. So that's with oxygen. You need oxygen, so you can see how oxygen is used here at the electron transport chain, and we know it's the last electron acceptor in that electron transport chain. Other ways you can make ATP is with just glycolysis. So this is called anaerobic respiration. So you're breaking down glucose, but you are not going into the whole Krebs cycle. You're just doing this part. So glycolysis occurs, and this is going to be called anaerobic respiration, otherwise called fermentation. And a byproduct of that is going to be lactic acid or lactate. You do make ATP, right? So ATP is generated in this step. You get 2 ATPs here. A third way of generating ATP inside the muscle cells is with an enzyme and a substrate. So it's called substrate level phosphorylation. And we're using a substrate called creatine phosphate. And creatine phosphate will use this phosphate and phosphorylate our ADP so that we can make ATP, and we get left over some creatine. This is a very fast step. It's only one enzymatic reaction, so it's really quick. And it's another way that our cells can provide ATP. So here is just a little closer look at the creatine phosphate system. So we have this creatine phosphate, right? ADP plus ADP. The enzyme that catalyzes this process is called creatine kinase. So kinases, as you remember, are enzymes that phosphorylate other molecules. And so you're taking this phosphate group, you're putting it onto ADP, you're creating your ATP here, and you have leftover a creatine waste product. So when your cells are at rest and you're not asking it to contract or demanding it to work, you're going to have low levels of ATP inside the cells. So at rest, you have a small store of ATPs, but when you get that impulse to start contracting, you're going to want to, this really small amount of ATP is not going to last very long. It lasts about 1 second in a working muscle cell. So you need to generate more ATP immediately. And what your muscles can do is use this creatine method. So this is a very fast way to make ATP. So let me just put that down. So this is very quick, right? If you look at the whole process in here, the most efficient way to make ATP is with oxygen. It's with the whole cell respiration process using oxygen. This gives you the most ATP per glucose molecule. but it's slow. It's a slower process because you have to go through all these different catabolic steps in order to start generating ATP. The faster, when you need ATP quickly, the fastest process would be the creatine phosphate. All right, so that's the reason why it's there, is because it's very fast. You can generate ATP quickly, and then after that wears out, then you can start to, like, that's when the other processes start to ramp up their ATP production. So it's a very quick form of stored energy, and you can supply the ATP necessary for that muscle contraction. And this is going to take, in those first basically 8 to 10 seconds of muscle contraction, this is where you're going to use the ATP made by this creatine phosphate. One thing about the reaction here, it's reversible, so you can see the reversible sign. And so when you're low on ATP, right, when this one starts to go down, it starts to drive the reaction, so you make more ATP. So when you see that this point here, low amounts of ATP drives the reaction to the right, because this reaction can also go in the opposite direction. So you can actually, if you have a lot of ATP, you can actually create more creatine phosphate. So this is very fast, very quick, can supply 5 times the quantity of resting ATP. So you get that first 8 to 10 seconds of muscle contraction using this method for generating ATP. Now, creatine phosphate, this is interesting because it is sold as a supplement. And I think that if you're interested in this, go ahead and read. I want everybody to read the little excerpt on the discovery section in your textbook on the creatine phosphate system, because your cells do make this normally, right? Our metabolism and our genetics we're making this in our muscle cells already. So does taking more provide more? So the answer is no. There's a limit. Well, the answer is only a little bit. So there's a limit to how much creatine phosphate can be in your muscle cells. You can't overload your muscle cells with creatine phosphate. It just doesn't work. So if you're eating or taking creatine phosphate and you're adding this into your body with a supplement, then the natural system to make the creatine phosphate will go down, because your body's like, hey, we have enough creatine phosphate. We don't need to make this stuff, right? You're getting it from your supplement. Anyways, read the little excerpt. It does kind of bump up just 10 to 15%, or I think it was 15 to 20%, but there's a limit as to how much creatine you can put in your muscle fibers. And it's really going to be used for these really fast, quick actions. So after that, let's just talk about this graph here, right? So this is, so when we start to ask our muscles to do some work, the first ATP source is going to come from our creatine phosphate, right? Because it's very fast. It's one enzymatic reaction will give you ATP. So this is a fast ATP source. After that, the second fastest, and you notice that the oxidative phosphorylation is ramping up, right? It's a slow incline, but it is starting to ramp up. But what's faster than oxidative phosphorylation is anaerobic glycolysis. So this is where you just do the glycolysis reaction. You're making just a little bit of ATP, 2 ATPs per glucose. Not much, but it's faster. So that's going to provide the second few minutes of exercise ATP. Then after that, that process goes down, right? So you can see the 2-minute mark here. And after that process goes down, then oxidative phosphorylation takes over, and that's going to be your source of energy for the long haul. So that's going to provide an unlimited amount of ATP as long as you have oxygen delivered to your delivered to your muscle cells. All right, so that looked at basically number 2 in your outline. When you begin to exercise with light to moderate intensity, we have oxidative phosphorylation is going to be the primary source of your ATP, but it takes time for that to ratchet up because, again, it has so many different chemical reactions for you to get that ATP, that in the very first few minutes, you have the creatine phosphate first, and then you have anaerobic glycolysis, and then that provides the ATP in those first few minutes before oxidative phosphorylation has a chance to ramp up and provide the ATP you need. But this is the best, right? Oxidative phosphorylation is the most efficient way to get your ATP from a glucose molecule. It's the complete combustion of glucose, and you get a lot more ATP. The only thing is you need to have a constant supply of oxygen. So you need to make sure, so these exercises, right, they're light to moderate because it's assuming that you're getting all the oxygen to the muscle cells it needs to provide ATP for oxidative phosphorylation. But what about if you're doing intense exercises? So what happens here is that you are using your muscles so intensely that the oxygen actually does not get to those muscle fibers in enough time. So what we see here is something similar, right? We start with our creatine phosphate, ATP. That's going to go down under a minute, and you see anaerobic glycolysis take over. And anaerobic glycolysis is going to stay high because what's missing is no oxygen is getting to your muscle fibers. Your muscle fibers are working so hard that whatever oxygen is there, it's used up. You're not getting a renewed source. So the primary source of ATP in intense exercises is going to be anaerobic glycolysis. Now, remember that anaerobic glycolysis, when you're just doing glycolysis, you had that byproduct, right? Lactic acid. So lactic acid is going to be generated in this kind of activity, in these intense exercises like you can see this person. I don't even know what this is called. It's hard. I've done it once. But that lactic acid is going to be generated in large amounts in these cells. And there's lots of differing kind of opinions here with soreness. Some people say that this lactate buildup makes you sore. Your textbook says it gives you that burning sensation inside your muscles. I think that's pretty legitimate. Like I've seen lots of sources with that. So when your muscles are burning from activity, that's that lactic acid buildup. And then they fatigue really quickly. So this kind of activity causes fatigue in your muscle fibers very, very quickly. It can't sustain this intensity of activity relying on anaerobic glycolysis. So it does fatigue. The fatigue, we'll talk about in a little bit, might be due to the lactate buildup. Now sources are saying it's not that. And that's what your enrichment video is on, muscle fatigue. But we'll talk about that in a second. But what I wanted you guys to see here is that the predominant way you're making ATP in this really intense exercise is through anaerobic glycolysis. All right. So these are just some examples of different speeds of contraction on different muscles. I actually was not planning to talk about this. It's made in my lecture. We can ignore that. Okay. So the next big topic is basically the types of skeletal muscle fibers that you have. So there are 3 different muscle fibers in your body, and they all are physically different, and they are going to metabolize energy differently. They have different kind of biochemistry. You inherit a ratio of these 3 muscle types. Muscle fiber types, right? And every muscle in your body will actually have a mixture of these muscle fiber types. The muscle fiber types are organized into 3 different names. So if you look at number 2, under letter B, types of skeletal muscle fibers, there's something called slow oxidative. So here, slow oxidative fibers. There is another kind of fiber called a fast glycolytic fiber. And the third kind, an intermediate kind, called fast oxidative. Okay, so there's these 3 different fiber types. They behave differently, and you inherit, your genetics determine this ratio of fast oxidative versus slow oxidative versus fast glycolytic fibers in your body. And so genetically, you can be better at distance running or endurance sports than maybe someone or genetically you can be born with basically fibers that will make you a better sprinter or a better boxer, or just being better at like these fast, explosive kind of activities. So let's take a look at the first topic, number 1, fast twitch fibers and slow twitch fibers. So the fast and slow, right, the fast here and the slow is basically how quickly the muscle can contract. And that depends on ATPase on the myosin head. So how fast muscles can contract depends on the rate of the myosin ATPase activity. So remember that your myosin head comes up like this, right? And there's a binding site for actin and there's a binding site for ATP. So this is the ATPase site on the myosin head. So the breakdown of ATP, remember ATP was required to detach the myosin head from actin and then cock back into the high energy form of the myosin head. So that is the rate limiting step. That's the slowest step of the whole muscle contraction process. So how fast this works to break ATP down determines how fast you can get muscle contraction and how fast you can pull those Z lines close together. So with fast fibers, they have really fast ATPase activity. They contract 2 to 3 times more faster than your slower fibers, and they also tend to relax more rapidly. Whereas the slower fibers, they are going to have slow ATPase enzyme activity. They contract about 10 times longer. The contractions last 10 times longer. So they take a longer time to contract, but they also can stay contracted a lot longer. So that's why these fibers are good for things that require endurance or for contraction for long periods of time. So if you are doing yoga, for example, you have to hold a pose for a long time. Like that would be something that slow fibers would be very good at because they can hold that contraction for a long time. All right, so let's take a look at the 3 different kinds of fibers here. And let's go through one at a time and then we can compare some things. So we can start with the slow. Let's start with your outline, slow oxidative fibers. So slow means slow to contract and also slow to relax, so it can stay contracted longer. These fibers, the oxidative refers to the fact that it relies on oxygen to make ATP. So it's going to do your oxidative phosphorylation to make ATP. This obviously is going to rely on a steady supply of oxygen, right? So this is an aerobic fiber. It requires oxygen to make your ATP. And where does all this happen? In the mitochondria. So these fibers that rely on oxygen are going to have more mitochondria than your other fiber types. And the reliance on the oxygen means that they actually store oxygen inside of their cells, and they store it with this protein called myoglobin. So myoglobin is a protein that has a pigment to it. It's actually red, okay, protein pigment. And it has a higher affinity to oxygen than hemoglobin. So if you're not familiar with hemoglobin, or you forgot hemoglobin is a protein inside your red blood cells that carries oxygen. So this myoglobin is a cousin, right? It's very similar to hemoglobin, but it has a higher affinity for oxygen than hemoglobin, which means that it can take the oxygen away from hemoglobin and attach that oxygen and hold it in your skeletal muscle cells, and it won't lose it to the bloodstream. It won't lose that oxygen to hemoglobin as your blood goes by. So that stores oxygen. So you have a ready store of oxygen. And this red pigment makes these fibers appear darker. So slow oxidative fibers are also sometimes called red fibers. They're physically darker. Now, on that same oxygen, the capillaries, these kinds of fibers are going to have more capillaries going to them because, of course, your blood delivers oxygen. All right, so that's basically what we have with the ATP production and our reliance on oxygen. But what about just how much power it can make? So these small fibers have a small diameter. And from the first part of the lecture, you should understand that if you have a small diameter of a fiber, it can't produce that much force, so it has low tension. It's going to just have a small tug. It's not as strong as your larger diameter fibers. However, because of the whole process of relying on oxygen, it's resistant to fatigue, so we're not going to have no lactic acid buildup, right? And it produces a lot of ATP, so as long as you have oxygen to make that ATP, you can continue to work that muscle. It's going to be resistant to fatigue. All right, so let's look at the next type, which is fast. Let's do fast glycolytic first. Oops. So the second one in your outline, the next one is the opposite end of the spectrum. So these fast glycolytic fibers are super fast to contract. The glycolytic refers to the fact that use glycolysis to make their ATP. So glycolytic fibers will undergo anaerobic respiration primarily to make their ATP. Because of this, we know that we're building up our lactic acid. And because it relies so much on glycolysis, we have a lot of these enzymes floating around, right? That shouldn't be too much of a surprise. We're not going to have that many mitochondria because we don't rely on oxygen to make ATP, and the mitochondria is where that happens, so we don't need that many of those organelles. Remember that glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm of the muscle fiber. So because we're generating ATP with glycolysis, and glycolysis is a very inefficient way to make ATP. So one glucose molecule will only give you 2 ATPs, right? So if you do cellular respiration, you make 32 ATPs. So what you're going to do is you're going to use a lot more glucose, because if one glucose only gives you 2 ATPs, then you have to burn a lot more glucose to give you the same amount of ATPs. So you're going to have a lot of glycogen stores in these muscle fibers. Glycogen, remember, is a chain of glucose, of course, you remember. And so that way you have this reserve of organic glucose, so you can use it for glycolysis. Very little oxygen present because this is an anaerobic process, and quick to fatigue, okay? The other characteristic you need to know is that these fast glycolytic fibers are really big. They have a large diameter, so that means that they have can create a lot of tension. They're very powerful muscles, a lot of tension. They're good for power. All right, so then there's this intermediate type, right? The fast oxidative fibers. So fast oxidative is just a mix between the two. And if you want some kind of analogy, these, so slow oxidative, these are kind of like your postural. If you need something to work all day, your posture, right? So muscles of your back that keep you standing up, muscles of your leg that need to contract while you're standing, or just keeping your body upright, you're going to need these muscles to contract all day long. So this is an example of slow oxidative fibers. Your fast glycolytic fibers, let's say you're jumping, right? An explosive fast action that requires this kind of muscle, recruits this kind of muscle type. And then fast oxidative, this middle one, would be walking. Okay, you can walk all day if you wanted to, as long as you had oxygen delivered to these cells. So there's an intermediate level of the myosin ATPase activity. There is a high oxidative capacity, so these are aerobic muscles, right? The fast oxidative refers to aerobic. They do have myoglobin, so they do store their oxygen. They're slow to fatigue, but they're just a little bit faster than the slow oxidative fibers. And they have an intermediate diameter, so they have an intermediate tension, right? They're intermediately strong. So anyhow, those are the three different types of fibers in your body. Let's take a look at just a fun thing here. This is almost Thanksgiving, if you're taking this in the fall and you're listening to this. So we have dark meat and white meat on a turkey, right? So what's the difference between the two? It's skeletal muscle. Well, the dark meat is dark because it has more myoglobin. Okay, so this is going to be your red fibers. And the white meat is white because it has no myoglobin, because it is the fast kind of fibers, fast glycolytic fibers. So where do you find this dark meat on the bird? You find it in the thigh and the leg, right? So what do turkeys do most of the time? What's their most demanding activities? Standing and walking, but standing. So their endurance is in their legs. Their legs have to be built for endurance, for contracting to keep them upright. And the breast is going to control their wings. And so turkeys don't fly, but they're going to flap their wings if they come in contact with a predator, or to get away, or when they're scared. So they're going to have these fast, explosive actions with their wings. But the breast, right, the breast tissue, the breast muscles are going to control their wings. Anyways, this is kind of a nice example of the two fiber types and how we can see the difference. And I hope it's not too disgusting to say we can taste the difference. with the different kinds of myoglobin in one, not the other. And the other kind of fun thing to talk about is just this. So if you get red raw meat and you see this red liquid, that's not blood, okay? So think about dried blood. Dried blood clots, it coagulates, it turns black. So this is not blood. This is actually myoglobin that's seeping out of the meat, okay? So it's water and myoglobin, right? So it's pink in color, that's that myoglobin pigment. So you don't need to get squeamish, it's not blood. All right. So this is just a fun picture of your oxidative and glycolytic muscles, red versus white, so you can really see the contrast between a darker muscle fiber and the neighbor, a white one. You can also see the diameter difference, right? These darker ones are smaller in diameter when we look at the overall diameter of these white ones. So now we come to the table. So this table should really make sense to you going through each kind of fiber. So if we take a look at the oxidative capacity, right? Here's our slow oxidative, here's our intermediate, and then this is our fast glycolytic. So we have our two ends of the spectrum and the intermediate in the middle. So with oxygen, right, we have two they have oxidative in the name, so of course they're going to have high oxygen capacity, whereas the fast glycolytic has low. Glycolytic capacity, the capacity to use glycolysis to make ATP, right, using that anaerobic respiration. So low. Slow oxidative fibers don't do that much. Intermediate here and high, of course, for the fast glycolytic fibers. Speed of contraction should make sense. Slow, intermediate, fast. That is related directly with the myosin ATPase activity. The mitochondrial density, right? So this is your place where you need oxygen. So we're going to have two high fiber types with a lot of mitochondria, not so much in our fast glycolytic. Capillary density, same thing, right? If it depends on oxygen, it'll have more capillaries, not so much if you don't depend on oxygen. Same with myoglobin, because myoglobin stores oxygen, high, high, low. Resistance to fatigue, now it's just high. The best fibers for endurance will be your slow oxidative, followed by your intermediate, then your fast glycolytic. Fiber diameter, same thing. Small diameter, small force. So take a look at these two. These two are related, right? If it has a small diameter, has a low force generating capacity. Intermediate diameter, intermediate force. Large diameter, high force. And the motor unit size. So motor unit size is basically the size of how many fibers are in that motor unit. So one motor neuron is going to innervate many muscle fibers, and all the muscle fibers in that unit are the same. So they're all slow glycolytic, or they're all fast oxidative, or they're all fast glycolytic. And it turns out that the slow oxidative fiber motor units are typically small, and then they increase in size as you go. Okay, I think that was it for, okay. Let's talk about fatigue. So muscles do fatigue, right? So you can think of this as a protective mechanism for the muscle to slow down the muscle use before you run completely out of ATP. Because remember what happens when you run out of ATP? That's rigor, right? So no ATP equals rigor or rigor. I've heard both. I've always heard rigor mortis, so I say rigor. So that means that if you're doing something and exercising and all of a sudden you run out of ATP, your muscles are going to lock in place and you're going to hurt yourself, because that muscle can just like get locked, reach tetanus, and that's it. So we don't do that. So your muscles get tired gradually. And so with high intensity exercises, you do build up your lactic acid. And this may be caused by lowering of the pH and interfering with cell activity. Remember, lactic acid also helps you feel that burn when you're working out. Strong contractions can also just, outside of what's going on molecularly, just overall, when you're contracting your muscles a lot, you can actually compress the blood vessels that are delivering oxygen to your muscles. So you can actually restrict the oxygen flow to the muscles, but also lactic acid is being carried away by the bloodstream as well, so you can also limit that. And then you have neuromuscular fatigue, which is if you're really working hard. So remember, the number of action potentials increases with the intensity of that work. So the more action potentials that come, the frequency of action potentials, you get more muscle tension, right? So if you're working super hard, you're lifting really heavy weights, you're going to fatigue out literally your acetylcholine. So you can deplete the acetylcholine. And at some point, you just run out of acetylcholine and you can't contract your muscles anymore. I want to talk about one more thing, which was mentioned in the enrichment video that you have. And this is actually the more favored view now about what causes muscle fatigue. And that is that you're using, remember, anytime you create an action potential, you are exchanging your potassium ions and your sodium ions, right? So they are depolarizing, repolarizing. So if you're constantly creating action potentials on the plasma membrane of a muscle, sooner or later, right, you're opening these sodium channels and potassium channels, constantly causing multiple depolarizations. And remember how the direction of movement with potassium leaving the cell and sodium coming into the cell, that was based on a concentration gradient. So what happens is the more you allow these guys to diffuse down their concentration gradient, you're going to get a smaller concentration gradient. And these ions are going to diffuse away, and you're just not going to have that concentration gradient. So that is one thing they think that you basically deplete your ions for that action potential to occur, and that's what causes your muscles to stop working. And it takes time for you to the sodium potassium pump to sort of work to recreate that gradient. So that's kind of what's going on with the thought process of why muscles fatigue now, is that you're depleting the concentration gradient. So it takes a few minutes to rebuild that. Okay, that is muscle fatigue. And now let's talk about training. So when you're exercising and training your muscles, this is looking at two different kinds of exercise. So you can have aerobic exercise, like jogging, or you can have like high intensity exercises. This could be like lifting weights, or doing explosive actions, like really rapid explosive actions, maybe like jumping. Okay. So when you do more aerobic exercises, you're training your slow oxidative fibers to become more resistant to fatigue. So you're going to increase their capacity to, to undergo cellular respiration, to use that glucose to make ATP. So you're just increasing the ability for these cells to make more ATP with oxygen. You're going to increase the size and number of mitochondria. These guys are related, okay? And you're also going to increase the number of capillaries surrounding the muscle cells. So those are related topics, because what do capillaries do is they give oxygen. So there is a mechanism. Your blood vessels can actually grow capillaries in towards a tissue that needs more oxygen. And then here we have a decrease in fiber diameter. So if you're only doing aerobic activity, maybe some of your intermediate muscles will actually start to shunt more into this slow oxidative fiber type and become smaller, or decrease in muscle diameter. And then here, some fast glycolytic fibers can be converted to fast oxidative fibers. So this is that two ends of the spectrum, right? This is our very fast anaerobic fiber. It can be converted to use oxygen, so fast oxidative fiber. So overall, you gain the capacity to use oxygen more efficiently, you use more oxygen, and you have more endurance. So when you do aerobic exercises, you're working up endurance. If you're doing high intensity exercises, what you're training your muscles to do is to decrease its oxidative capacity. So it's going to lean more on anaerobic respiration to make ATP, because it's faster, right? It makes ATP faster. It doesn't have to go through if you're doing these explosive activities, you need ATP like in those first few seconds. You don't wait 2 minutes for the oxidative phosphorylation to ratchet up. You just need it now. So it's going to train the cells to use anaerobic respiration to make ATP. Because now you're using more anaerobic respiration, you're going to decrease the size and number of mitochondria. And you're also going to reduce your resistance to fatigue, so you can get tired faster. In the same vein, right, you can increase the fiber diameter. They become stronger, more powerful. You can gain more power this way. This is hypertrophy. Your muscle fibers get bigger and more packed with myofibrils, so that it can contract with more power. And then you can also train some of your fast oxidative fibers to go, that intermediate group, to become fast glycolytic fibers. So this is all while you're actively training. If you stop training, then your muscle fibers, like in this example here, they can actually slide back to their previous genetic behavior. Okay. All right, so our next topic here before we wrap up is just some spindles and then smooth and cardiac muscles. So our muscle receptors, there are receptors in our muscles that can determine the stretch of our muscles, and it feeds to your brain, and your brain can know like how stretched or how contracted your muscles are. So there's something called muscle spindles. And muscle spindles are cells that are inside the muscle tissue itself, so it's surrounded by your muscle fibers, and these spindles are called intrafusal fibers. Okay, so the intrafusal fibers are specialized muscle fibers, and they can detect stretch, and they're associated with a neuron. So they're not neurons themselves, they're specialized muscle fibers. So you can see how it's surrounded by our extrafusal, the word extrafusal just meaning outside of, and that's basically the muscle fibers itself. Then you can see the blue, right? We have afferent fibers that send action potentials to the central nervous system that are around our intrafusal element there. So what happens is, basically as your muscles stretched, the intrafusal muscles will also stretch, and those will send action potentials in the afferent fiber, and the more your muscle is stretched, the more action potentials are created, so your brain knows that your muscle is being stretched. So here's just an image of that. So this is a relaxed muscle. You're not doing anything, and we have sort of a baseline action potential, right? The frequency of action potentials. Then you can see what happens when it's stretched. You have an increase of action potentials, and if it's contracted, then you have a drastic decrease in the frequency of action potentials. So your brain just basically puts this together, right? If we have a decrease in action potentials coming from a specific intrafusal fiber, then your brain knows this muscle is being contracted, right? If it's receiving an increase or rapid increase in frequency of action potentials, your brain knows it's being stretched. The next one is the Golgi tendon organ, or the Golgi tendon organ, which is just the same kind of concept but in the tendon. So this is wrapped around the collagen fibers in the connective tissue of the tendon, and so you can actually feel the tendons stretch. And so this is really good because you know that when your muscles contract, they're going to pull on a bone. And your muscles when they contract, they get shorter. So when they get shorter, they're actually also pulling and tugging on that tendon. So it tells your brain, obviously, how much the tendon is being pulled and stretched and how much force your muscle's putting on the bone. But the protective mechanism here is that, do I have the picture? No. There is a reflex called the Golgi tendon reflex, and this is in your notes, where it's the idea is protection against overactivity of a muscle. So let's just pretend that you are lifting up something so heavy and so strong, and you're putting so much force into it that this muscle contracts so much that it can be torn off the bone, right? So this tendon can actually tear off the bone. It happens all the time to people. The tendon comes off the bone. But what the Golgi reflex does is that when it feels that tension on the tendon because the muscle's contracting, if there's too much tendon, the Golgi, this afferent fiber, goes to the spinal cord and it synapses with an interneuron, and that actually sends a negative impulse down to the muscle, so it stops the muscle from contracting at the level of the spinal cord. So reflexes, FYI, and a reminder, is always in the spinal cord. It's never using the brain to do a reflex. So this is between the Golgi tendon organ and the spinal cord. So again, you're stretching your tendon way too much. This Golgi tendon organ is going to send the muscle to the spinal cord to inhibit the motor neuron that's telling your muscles to contract. So it's going to stop the contraction of the muscle, and that's to protect your muscle from being ripped from the bone. All right, question. When a muscle participates in light exercise, in which order does it rely on energy resources? I didn't mention this, but okay, so when you're relying on light exercise, right, you're relying on the glucose and fatty acids. So in what order are we going to do that? So we're going to do store glycogen, then blood glucose and fatty acids, and then mostly fatty acids for the blood. That's going to be it. So how did I miss that? So after about 30 minutes of exercise, I think that was in the first part. So if you go back to number 2, and look at oxidative phosphorylation, you use up your glycogen stores, and then after that, you're going to rely on glucose coming in from the blood, and then also the fatty acids coming in from the blood. After 30 minutes, you're actually using mostly fatty acids in making energy. So if you are looking to burn fat, you want to do aerobic exercises that last more than 30 minutes. So this is what the answer is. What are the properties of fast glycolytic muscle, which has less red blood vessels and mitochondria and dominates in white meat? So fast glycolytic are going to be fast, right? So we're into A or B. Strong contractions that do not fatigue easily or that fatigue quickly. And you should pick fatigue quickly. In addition to helping improve health in certain disease states, such as diabetes, what does aerobic exercise do to healthy muscles? All right, so aerobic exercise, if you're looking at your choices, it's not going to decrease your mitochondria, right? It's going to increase the mitochondria. And then what is it going to do to the fiber diameter? Is it going to increase the diameter of the fiber, as in letter A? Is it going to increase glycolytic enzymes and also the fiber diameter, or is it going to decrease the fiber diameter? The answer is decrease the fiber diameter. All right, so let's look at our last section here where we have smooth muscle and cardiac muscle contraction. So not a whole bunch of detail with cardiac muscle, just a little bit of detail in the smooth muscle contraction. So smooth muscle is different than skeletal muscle, right? It doesn't have those striations. It's found in your internal organs and your blood vessels. It's involuntary, so you don't have a motor neuron going to contract these muscles. You're going to have an autonomic neuron going to contract these muscles. The muscles are spindle shaped, so they have this tapered and fat in the middle kind of shape to them, and they're small, and they do contain actin and myosin. They don't have sarcomeres, but the actin and myosin do overlap. So let's take a look at the picture here. So we can see that we have a arrangement of the thick and thin filaments, actin and myosin, but in a way that we're not familiar with. It's just a different manner. But when they contract, they do slide past each other. So you can see the overlap here at just the tips. We have more of an overlap in the contracted muscle. And you can see the contraction is basically just kind of like making just like squeezing it all around it, squeezing it into a little ball. So the relaxed muscle is longer and the contracted muscle cell is a lot shorter. And so let's look at the, so this is just a comparison along the 3. We looked at our skeletal muscle, right? This looks very familiar to us. The smooth muscle is very different. So we're going to have the neuron come, and the neuron doesn't have the axon terminals that secrete the neurotransmitter. It actually has these little sort of sacs along the way called varicosities, and those actually store your neurotransmitter. And then you want to look very closely here, because you can see that there's gap junctions that are allowing these smooth muscle cells to be connected. Same as in cardiac muscle. The cardiac muscle had those intercalated discs, and that is where we have our gap junctions. Okay, so the cardiac muscle shares gap junctions like smooth muscle. Let's take a look at our next slide. Sorry, I'm having trouble with this. Okay, when a smooth muscle contracts, what happens is the calcium actually comes from outside of the cell first, whereas when we were talking about skeletal muscle, the calcium came from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this one, you have this voltage-gated calcium channel actually in the plasma membrane that opens and allows calcium to flood into the cell. This is with, by the way, a voltage, right? Voltage-gated. So we have an action potential that's opening up our voltage-gated calcium channel. This is going to actually prompt more calcium channels to open from the endoplasmic reticulum, so we have a rapid increase of calcium inside the cell. Now, different mechanism completely, right? We have this, the calcium is going to bind to a molecule called Calmodulin. This is a protein, okay? So calcium and Calmodulin together are going to activate an enzyme, this green guy, which is your myosin light chain kinase. It's a kinase. What do kinases do? It phosphorylates something. In this case, it's going to phosphorylate the myosin light chain. So the myosin is going to be activated. So it phosphorylates the myosin. Now it's active, and we can get cross-bridge cycling, and we get contraction. Okay, so we need that phosphorylation of the myosin head here in order for contraction to start. And that's mediated by Calmodulin, only working when there's calcium present, and that Calmodulin activates that kinase that ends up phosphorylating the myosin head. To undo the contraction of smooth muscle, there's another enzyme called phosphatases, right? Phosphatases are going to remove phosphate. So we have that phosphatase working, and we're going to have an unphosphorylated light chain. There's no ATP-ACE activity there, and so we cannot form a cross bridge. And that's about it. So we just depend on a few different kinds of mechanisms here. This is a phosphorylated myosin head versus an unphosphorylated myosin head, determining whether or not you have contraction or not. Let's take a look at the units of smooth muscle. So there's something called single unit and multi-unit smooth muscle. All that means is that single unit means that the smooth muscle acts as one unit. So it contracts together as a single unit. And what multi-unit means is that each muscle fiber can contract individually. And so each fiber receives its own innervation. So let's just take a look at this, right? So if we have a multi-unit, what we see is that our autonomic neuron and the varicosities are going to be branched out and threaded throughout the whole smooth muscle, so that every single muscle fiber, muscle cell here, gets its own little acetylcholine bump. Okay. And so each cell in this multi-unit structure can contract separately. In this single unit, we see our autonomic nervous system, our autonomic fiber come in and just kind of graze the top, because if it causes a contraction in this one smooth muscle cell, it's linked to the other smooth muscle cells by gap junctions. So their cytoplasm's all linked. And so if one depolarizes, all the other will depolarize. And so the communication spreads very rapidly, and they can all contract together. Yeah, I think that was it with that. And cardiac muscle, just a quick word on cardiac muscle. It's striated with the same sarcomeres that we're familiar with skeletal muscle. We have the same kind of troponin, tropomyosin regulation that's in skeletal muscle. They do have gap junctions. They do have pacemaker cells. We'll cover this a little bit more in the cardiac muscle unit. It's innervated again by the autonomic nervous system. So just to review, right, pacemaker cells, this is our SA node, AV node. These are going to generate their own impulse. So we don't need external nervous system to generate the impulse. We don't need neurons to come in and tell our heart to beat. The heartbeat is set up by itself. But you can speed up or slow down the heartbeat with the autonomic nervous system input. So you can mediate the heartbeat with the nervous system, but the heart itself, the beat, right, the pace of the heartbeat does not require external nervous system. Okay, calcium comes in from the extracellular fluid and the sarcoplasmic reticulum, kind of like your smooth muscle here. And don't remember about no summation. That's not important. All right, so this is just a wrap up of all the different kinds of muscles and how they contract. So skeletal muscle, our smooth muscle, and our cardiac muscle. So you can take a look at this as you're studying and see if things make sense. And some questions before we end this. What is a feature that makes cardiac muscle different from skeletal muscle? All right, so what's the answer here? It's D, right? Because skeletal muscle doesn't have gap junctions, but cardiac muscle does. Which is not true of smooth muscle. Okay, so which one's false? It is regulated by autonomic neurons. This is true. Thick and thin neurons run obliquely. This is true. It does not contain tropomyosin. This is also true. And the calcium signal that triggers cross-bridge activity targets actin or the thin filaments. This is our false one, right? The calcium binds to calmodulin. What is required to end smooth muscle contraction? All right, you should come up with the phosphatase enzyme. All right, and that is our lecture.